Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of podcasts. We have cookies.
Cookies? Me love cookies.
Hey, creepy people. This is P&W Haunts and Homicides. I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Cassie.
Together, we explore stories of the paranormal and true crime throughout the Pacific Northwest. For each episode, we do a tarot reading to help us gain some insight on the topic as we share the facts of the case and our interpretations. You can find our episodes featuring true stories from infamous cases such as the misdeeds of Boeing, as well as lesser-known true crime cases like the murders in Tunnel 13.
As well as our spooky stories from Pike Place and Raven's Manor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you'd like to listen. Have a creepy-ass day.
Hey, you must know you're listening to a true crime podcast. I like colorful language, so if swear words upset you, I just might not be the host for you. Listen at your own discretion. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. Welcome back to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ+. I'm your host, CJ. Happy Pride Month, everybody. Boy, I've been a busy bee lately. I'm so tired. I swear to you, I felt like I've had an extended amount of jet lag, and I've been trying to bounce back for the last week or so. I'm finally starting to feel a little more human. But my poor house is a mess, and I've not just added my daughter and her boyfriend to the mix, but we've added 2 more dogs, 2 more cats, and, yes, a snake to the household. In addition to moving a whole U-Haul full of stuff, people, and animals into my 1-car garage and house, we ended up laying laminate flooring in my daughter's room. And we got it all done in one day. Her boyfriend, of course, did most of the work, but it looks amazing. Unfortunately, though, I've been a little displaced in my podcast work area because of all their stuff. Oh well. I'm hoping soon we can put the house back together. And for the time being, I don't know, it might even be a permanent thing, I'm back in the closet recording for you. I'm on the socials as Rainbow Crimes and Darkcast Network. And a huge thank you to Batman P1219, who gave me a 5-star review and said, "Just discovered this podcast. I love the mix of true crime and LGBTQIA+ history. I also appreciate the side commentary. Usually I am thinking or saying the same thing." That was a super cool review. Thanks again, Batman P1219. The end of August, I'll be at the True Crime Paranormal Festival in Austin, Texas. I sure hope to see some of your beautiful faces there. If you go to the festival's website, which I'll leave a link in the show notes for, and you type in Beyond at checkout, you'll receive 15% off all your tickets. And you really should go to the festival's website anyway so you can see all the cool shows that are going to be there. Please also consider joining my Patreon. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes as well. You'll get ad-free, early release episodes, as well as a unicorn named for you, and 1 extra episode at the end of every month. Well, I think that covers our housekeeping. Let's get into our cases. Our main story today takes place in Connecticut, 1988. When we go back to cases in the 80s, I think my mind always tracks to the autoimmune deficiency syndrome, or better known as the AIDS epidemic. By 1988, the HIV virus and AIDS had been known to the scientific community for nearly 7 years, and it had been known to the general public for nearly 5 years. Many people were scared of AIDS, but for different reasons than today. Back then, people were scared they'd get HIV from public restrooms, or even that being within 10 feet of a gay person, and that gay person didn't even have to be infected, but being near any gay person could give you the HIV virus. Although now we should know HIV and AIDS is not a gay person disease. But in the mid-80s through the mid-90s, many people perceived it as such, as the virus seemed to hit the LGBTQ community the hardest. Keeping this in mind, when we look at cases in the 80s, it's a little easier to see why the general public as a whole placed blame on the LGBTQ instead of empathy. Although this case is not about AIDS or HIV, I just kind of wanted to set the tone and the mindset of people of the 80s and how they perceived gay people. And once again, just like we're going through with trans people these days, ignorance breeds fear and fear breeds hate. The early morning hours of May 15, 1988 would see 33-year-old Richard Reill's life come to a screeching halt. Prior to these dates, Richard was out to seize the proverbial pearl from life's oyster. He was looked at by his community as a positive role model. He had earned a computer science degree from Boston University, and he was enrolled for his master's degree in business at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. Richard was lucky for the fact that he had a family who loved and supported him as he lived his truth. He also had a passion for photography. Richard was working for the Aetna Health Insurance Company as a systems analyst, and in his spare time he volunteered teaching economics to middle school kids. Yes, Richard had goals. On the evening of May 14th, Richard, who lived in Wethersfield, Connecticut, thought he would take a break from the hard work he was putting in, and he thought maybe he would let his hair down for a while. He took a 9-minute drive from his home to Chez Est. Chez Est is a gay-owned restaurant, bar, and cabaret, and it's still in operation today. I have to say it looks kind of bumpin'. There's drag shows, a pool table, a place to dance. It honestly looks like a lot of fun. Richard stayed nearly till closing time at Chez Est, and then he headed out to the parking lot. In the parking lot, he was approached by 2 young men. It's unclear if the young men looked older than they were, or if maybe Richard assumed they were older because they were out so late and in a bar parking lot. So Richard invited them back to his place. 16-year-old Marcos Perez and 17-year-old Sean Burke, well, they were glad to follow Richard back to his home. Like Richard, they too had goals. Only the goals of these young men were much more heinous. And there was no way Richard would have known Marcos and Sean had attacked, beaten, and robbed a gay man just the night before. Once back at Richard's condo, Marcos and Sean subdued Richard. They duct-taped his mouth and his hands. Once bound, Sean took a fire log from Richard's fireplace and he started to beat him with it. And while Sean did this, Marcos screamed at Richard that he hated fags and he wanted to kill him. Both boys took turns beating their hostage. At one point, Richard was able to escape his captors and he ran. He got as far as outside the front of his condo, where Marcos and Sean caught up with him. Once Richard was caught, the boys continued to beat and kick him. And then suddenly, Marcos and Sean just left. They did come back a little while later to make sure Richard was dead. And just to make sure, Sean hit him a few more times with the log. As the sun rose on May 15th, a couple of newspaper carriers discovered Richard's lifeless body. Police were called out. The detectives interviewed neighbors and even the gay places in and near Hartford, including Chez Est. But the potential gay witnesses were frightened to talk and feared that the same thing would happen to them if they did. Eventually, 16-year-old Marcos Perez and 17-year-old Sean Burke, they became on the police suspect list, and police rounded him up for questioning. Marcos told police he hated gays because he'd been molested by a man when he was 8 years old. Sean, who was a star high school quarterback, also said he didn't like gays. Both young men admitted to beating Richard and the gay man they attacked and robbed the night prior to Richard's death. Both young men were arrested and placed in separate jails so they couldn't communicate with one another. Each young man had their bond set at $200,000. It was also found Sean was involved in at least 4 other attacks of gay men. He was trying to form a gang called the Reformers. The idea behind this gang was to capture and beat gay men until they were straight. Oh, honey, once again, sexual identity doesn't work that way. You can't pray it away, and you can't beat it out of someone. I really don't get why there's such ignorant people out there who think you can. At the trials of the young men, prosecution went after each of them for gay bashing, and in spite of being juvenile offenders, they were tried as adults. Marcos received a 35-year sentence and Sean a 40-year sentence. Marcos applied for early probation, but he was denied. He ended up dying in prison. At the age of 35 in 2006, Sean made an appeal for a sentence modification to get his time reduced. He asked for forgiveness from Richard's family. He told the judge his soul was empty and he wanted to use the rest of his life for reparation of Richard's life. Richard's family asked the judge not to consider an earlier release date for fear of the message it would send to others about hate crimes. But based on Sean's model behavior in prison, Sean was granted a reduced sentence. He was out on parole way before his release date in 2017. Because of Richard's murder in 1988, several laws were put into legislation to protect the LGBTQ. By 1990, Connecticut no longer allowed businesses to discriminate against LGBTQ+ people, but it took until 2019 for Connecticut to finally disallow the use of the gay panic defense in their courtrooms. Rest in power, Richard. Our True Crime Quickie this episode was actually my second Patreon exclusive episode. But it was kind of a good one, so I wanted to share it with everyone. It comes to us from Colorado and areas of California. The timeline was between 1988 and 2002. A publication called The Advocate lists the killer as bisexual, which he might very well be, although he's not outed himself as any sexual identity. He did sell himself as a gay sex worker, but like serial killer Gary Ray Bowles, he never came right out and said, "Yup, I'm gay," or "bye." But also like Gary Ray Bowles, he never really denied it either. Although I do think Gary Ray Bowles tried to allude to the fact that he was gay for pay only. And I kind of believe if he hated sex with men, he wouldn't have done it, and he would have found other means to make money for survival. So this case has another man named Sean as the main character. Sean Paul Hannafy was born in Aquarius on January 20th, 1970. He was born with a cleft palate and fetal alcohol syndrome. Sean also had a number of drugs in his system thanks to his birth mom. When he was only 9 months old, social services removed him and his 2 older brothers, who were also born with cleft palates, from their biological parents because of neglect, as well as physical and sexual abuse. At 9 months old, Sean was malnourished. He had 2 hernias, and he had something called rickets. Rickets is, I believe, more of an old-fashioned type illness, like scurvy. Only scurvy's from lack of vitamin C. Rickets is a deficiency of vitamin D and calcium, and it tends to make your bones weak and soft. So this kid, Sean Hannafy, was born into a terrible, horrible world. He was not given a healthy start at all. Once he was removed and went into the system, he actually had a fighting chance to be better and to do good things. Sometimes we talk about nurture versus nature. I almost always believe lack of nurture is why people turn out evil. Sean Paul Hannafy, however, might just be a nature killer, someone who was born predisposed to kill, and environment just kind of helped him along some. When Sean was 22 months old, he was adopted by Richard and Glenda Hannafy of Gillette, Wyoming. Sean was tiny for his age, and he stayed little even into his adult years. His adopted mom, Glenda, said he was such a good little boy until he started kindergarten. And once that happened, when he was 5 years old, Sean had a world of problems. The other kids teased him about his cleft palate and for being the smallest one in the class. Sean claimed at the age of 6, a mentally challenged neighbor had sexually molested him. He's 6. I think back to my days of being a daycare coordinator. A 6-year-old talking about someone, an adult no less, touching him in his privates or being made to touch the adult's privates. That would bring so many red flags. Therefore, I have a hard time believing Sean's claims were anything but the truth. Within a few months of his molestation claim, Sean began to harm animals and set fires, which we know are classic signs of early serial killer traits. And at that young age, Sean even ran away. He had many people looking for him. It took hours, but he was found miles away wandering an old country road. After that, his behavior just got worse. He claimed voices were telling him to protect himself and to hurt others before they hurt him. And he started to fantasize about his biological family. He started to believe the voice in his head was one of his older brothers. As Sean aged, he started asking his adopted parents about his birth family. Not just a couple of questions, but questions of all kinds all the time. He found out that his biological father was extremely violent and that he ended up getting murdered by his second wife. And this second wife was actually the first woman in the state of Kansas to use the battered woman defense. When Sean was 12 years old, his adopted parents took him to Denver to correct his cleft palate. The following year, his parents found him a therapist. I'm not going to say it was a good therapist, as Sean was only diagnosed with depression. And I think even us as pretend therapists can see that there was much more going on with this kid than depression. When Sean was 14 or 15, his adopted parents adopted an 11-year-old girl. When Sean was 16, he raped this girl, and then he was banished from his adopted family's house. At 17, Sean quit school, and he was admitted into Wyoming's Campbell County Hospital for psychiatric evaluations. He was not kept at the hospital, however. They released him. And since his adopted family didn't want him living with them again, and Sean didn't have any kind of job, he was forced by his adopted family to join the Job Corps in Denver, Colorado. Upon arriving in Denver, Sean quit the Job Corps and he got himself a job at a restaurant washing dishes. He was living with a drag queen named Samantha, and he was fascinated by the drag queen's lifestyle. He also decided he didn't like being in the workforce. After about a year of washing dishes, he quit. He took his last paycheck, and he bought as much crystal meth as he could with it. Sean had plans to become a meth dealer. It didn't quite work out as he was hoping, though, because he started to smoke the crack. In fact, any drug he could get, Sean would use. He smoked the crack, he injected heroin, and he was a very heavy drinker. When he was 18, he realized he needed money to support his habits. So he started to sell his body to men for sex. Since he was petite and boyish looking, he was very popular with men who had young boy fetishes. And I know that sounds pretty gross, but in the eyes of the law, Sean at 18 was a consenting adult and no longer a child. It didn't take long for him to develop a regular clientele of sugar daddies. These were guys who provided him with money for his drugs and often a place to sleep. Sean continually scammed whoever he came in contact with, and many times he was beat up for trying to screw over drug dealers or anyone who gave him money to buy drugs for them, and then Sean bought the drugs for himself. Those who got close to him as sugar daddies, he'd rob. Many were too scared to go to the cops because they were gay. Sean didn't get by unscathed, though. He had repeated arrests for solicitation, prostitution, lewd acts, shoplifting, and theft. But you know what? I was shocked to find that there were no possession of drug charges on that list. 59-year-old Edward Brown had been a longtime sugar daddy of Sean's. One night after smoking some crack, Edward and Sean made a plan to stage a break-in into Edward's home. Sean would steal various things of some worth from Edward, and then Edward would make a police report and take out an insurance claim on all the stolen items. But for some reason, Edward turned on Sean, and when he called the police for his report, he implicated Sean as the thief. Sean was arrested selling Edward's VCR to a pawn shop. He was found guilty and had to do 2 years in prison for the crime. While he was in prison for those 2 years, Sean had plenty of time to reflect on what happened. As he did, his anger grew. He hated Edward. He was duped by Edward. He started to make plans to destroy Edward upon his release. Edward did something different while Sean was in prison. He found God, and he was contributing time working with convicted felons through his church. While Sean was incarcerated, Edward corresponded a lot via letters with him. And Edward was even there to pick up Sean the day he was released from prison. Edward planned to take Sean home to live with him. 10 days later, firefighters were called to Edward's home to put out a fire that had just began. Once the flames were out, they found Edward's dead body on the couch and a knife stabbed into his face. Edward's penis had also been cut off and stuffed into his own mouth. After killing Edward and starting the fire, Sean took off in Edward's car. He started a 3-day drug-induced crime spree. He also had several hit-and-run accidents which made him abandon Edward's car. Then Sean was off to find another sugar daddy, one that he stole his car and an antique gun from. Eventually, Sean ditched his latest stolen car and police found him in a park. They arrested him and spent over 6 hours questioning him at the station. Sean finally admitted to killing Edward, and once he did that, it was almost as if the floodgates opened. Sean became a self-proclaimed serial killer to the detectives in a matter of hours. Sean said he killed 3 gay men who were paying him for sex in 1992. Those men are suspected to all be from Denver, Colorado. 57-year-old Robert Farrell was found dead in his boxer shorts in his apartment with 9 stab wounds. There was no evidence of forced entry into his apartment, but his apartment had been trashed and some of the items were missing. 41-year-old Anthony Carr, who was also known as Charles Hubbard, he was found dead under his Christmas tree covered in a blanket on December 29, 1992. He was clad only in his underwear, and he had 39 stab wounds to his body. His rental car had been stolen and abandoned. The other gay Denver man was 60-year-old Benjamin Zesch, and there's not much information on him. Although Sean claimed to have killed at least 7 men, including 2 in San Francisco and another in Utah, Sean denied killing anyone the police asked him about. To this day, the cases are cold and marked as unsolved. At the time, police suspected Sean of killing Robert Farrell and Anthony Carr, but they never did anything about it. I don't really get why. Was Sean so good at cleaning the crime scenes he left no traceable evidence? Or were the detectives just that lazy? Or maybe they just didn't care about gay men. Sean nearly offered up his killings to them on a silver platter. And what I really don't understand is why didn't prosecution offer him a sweet plea deal? Then they might have been able to close some of these cold cases. In the year 2000, Sean was strongly suspected of killing a 44-year-old homeless man named Mark Davis. Mark was found laying near Cherry Creek in Denver. He was partially buried in rocks and he had a knife sticking out of his neck. He'd been beaten on his head by a large rock and several large cracks in his skull because of it. There was also a note left by his body that said, "Killers in Time." Sean provided a handwritten note almost identical to the one found near Mark's body. When Sean was questioned about Edward's murder, he confessed. He told detectives about how Edward had double-crossed him and that Edward only liked him because he looked like a little boy. Sean pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. But a different sugar daddy witness said that Sean was too cunning to be insane. Sean knew exactly what he was doing. A forensic psychologist spent 12 hours with Sean and diagnosed him with bipolar psychosis disorder. And as we know, bipolar disorder really seems to be a blanket mental illness that's used and thrown around an awful lot. But the psychologist also declared Sean had mild retardation. Sean had confessed to the psychologist that he would return to the scene of many of his crimes. He wanted to open up his victim. And this is because he wanted to eat his victim's organs. But the bodies were decomposing and smelly, so he decided not to. Sean's trial by jury lasted 7 days. The jury came back and they found Sean sane, and they found him guilty of all charges he was accused of. The judge sentenced him to 2 life sentences without parole. Rest in power to all the victims of Sean Hannafy. Well, warriors, that wraps up another episode. I love ya. I just want you to remember always, you matter. And it's not a crime to be gay. Unless you're a murderer.